Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Staying. I am your host, Todd Rossnagel. It's great to have you back for another episode of our special video and podcast series produced by Louisiana Now here inside the Louisiana Conference. This particular episode, we are pleased to be joined by Reverend Truman Stagg, who is a local pastor who is serving at First United Methodist Church in Gonzales. He's only been there for about
3 months.
3 months, just a couple of weeks, and served at several smaller churches in the Louisiana Conference, and so we're excited to have his wisdom. And, of course, Van Stinson, who is the assistant to the bishop and has been our co-host, my co-host here for this entire series. Van, welcome back.
It's good to be back.
Yes, it's good to see you. So, Truman, welcome to the Staying video series. I remember getting a phone call or an email, I can't remember which, but you've been watching the video series, and you heard from Weldon Barres, one of our first episodes, and you said, that really truly connected with me, and I want to share my story.
That's true. I watched from the very beginning. I think Bishop Harvey made the first one, and I've been watching them all because I've been committed to staying, and I was wanting to hear what other people said. And I've watched most of them, but, Weldon speaks from the more traditional side, and as do I. And hearing Weldon put it into words gave me the optimism that we can still have good, rational discussions within the United Methodist Church. And it empowered me to do the same.
Yeah, and I mean, Weldon's words were fantastic. All of our guests have had shared fantastic thoughts. But so, just for clarity's sake, for our audience at home, you fall again. I apologize for the gagillionth time about labels and political language here, but you fall center right. You fall more to the traditional side. And so that begs the question, after seeing Weldon and hearing from you, the thought process is out there that if you have this traditional viewpoint, that you have to leave. And you're saying not so true.
I've never understood that. Right. In many ways, one thing that I love about the United Methodist Church is that we've always had a wide variety of opinions on many issues. And it's okay to disagree. I come from a conservative traditional background. I still have those basic views, if you pin me down, about marriage. But that's just one of hundreds of issues that we need to take up. And, the United Methodist Church is home, and maybe I'll get into a little bit later the number one reason why I would never pastor in another church.
Well, no time than now. What is that?
My call, it goes to my call.
Okay.
I received the call. No one was more surprised than me, except maybe my wife. Sitting in the Branch United Methodist Church on a cold Sunday morning in 1999, listening to a twice-retired pastor attempting to preach. We had a full house that day. All 6 of us were there. That was my home church. And I just, honestly, I said, Lord, this man needs to retire. Surely there could be someone better that could do a better job. And it was like this light bulb went off. I said, wait, I didn't mean me. But I got the call. My call was clear to go and offer myself to the United Methodist Church, not because I agreed with it 100%, not because I was fully in line, but God has called me to give myself to the United Methodist Church, and through 23 years of pastoral ministry, I have never felt the slightest inkling to change that. I have sat through our church. I have sat through annual conferences and all these things. I've heard these issues debated, and I have heard passion on all sides of the arguments. And at the end of the argument, we were still all United Methodists, and we all went back to our local churches and talked about Jesus. and talked about Jesus' love. And I don't see a reason to be leaving. I don't know why the sudden call to leave behind our home and our family over any one particular issue, which has still not been decided what our denomination is going to do on that.
Yeah. Van, as I listened to Truman, and for those who have been watching all of our video series, it's that, you said, I don't agree 100%, but that's okay. This idea that certainty, that we have to have everything lined up 100%, that's just never been what Methodism has been about.
No, it hasn't. And Truman captures it so beautifully that, one of the things that has been I think so unique about the Louisiana Conference, and we've been very specific in our focus, on the Louisiana Annual Conference and the impact of some of these larger issues, on our clergy, on our congregations. But one of the things that I think has stood out about our conference is the way in which we do just what you described, the way in which we relate to one another across theological differences, across cultural differences, no matter where you find yourself on the theological range from traditional to progressive, or what we used to call liberal to conservative, there's a place for you in the conversation. There's always a place for you at the table. And as we were alluding to earlier, in Louisiana, you never take a chair away from the table. You always add a place to the table.
Yes,
Doesn't matter who shows up, what time they show up, where they've been, what they've done, or where they've got to be in an hour. You're going to find them a seat at the table. That is just, it's just so much a part of who we are. And, Truman, for you to talk about your experience in Branch Church, all 6 of you, and to receive a call to give yourself to service in the United Methodist Church, that's such a beautiful acknowledgement of the built-in connection that exists in our tradition and in our conference. There was never any question of whether that call would be in a United Methodist context. It was just a part of who you were and who your church was.
Right. And in the midst of that, of answering that call, you are a local pastor, right. So you don't have an MDiv, you didn't go off to seminary, but talk a little bit about how that call as a local pastor was supported, because I think that support arm of the conference and in turn the denomination for those who seek to be a local pastor is very valuable and important.
Well, I appreciate the question. As a local pastor in our conference, yes, I've spent 1 hour on the grounds of a seminary. I walked around SMU on a Sunday afternoon just to see what it looked like. I took my classes as I was serving churches.
Sure.
I started out with a license to preach class of 22 people who were all called from different walks of life. Some of them serve some of the largest churches in our conference now. 1 or 2 of them do. Many have retired. Many have gone on to other things. But beginning this process, what I appreciate about the United Methodist Church is we have 2 routes. The route of being an elder or a deacon, going with the full seminary training, we need that. That's a calling on a lot of people. My personal call was urgent, and it felt like waiting 3 years to start to go to seminary was unfair and against my calling. I need to go now. At the same time, the conference had wonderful support outlook. The training process, we had to take 20 courses, seminary level courses. I took them at Millsaps College in Jackson. And the things that I learned on that ride back and forth, we carpooled, 3 or 4 local pastors would ride together. And the comradeship. And another thing about connection is the comradeship. I've got friends. If I made a list of my friends and I'm talking about close friends, people that I have a group that I Zoom with every Thursday afternoon. We have since the middle of COVID. You look across the theological spectrum of that group, and you'd say those people probably don't even know each other. And we would give our lives for each other. We call each other at 2 o'clock in the morning if things go wrong. And these are people that I disagree with on some of the issues. We're all called to be United Methodist clergy, and I think that's the beauty of it.
So speak to that, 'cause I think it's very powerful the way you just expressed that, a clergy support group that you meet with weekly and disagree on a lot of issues.
Several issues.
How do you hold that tension? Because that's the tension right now, is that there is someone in the room that we potentially disagree with. How do you hold that tension?
Well, and I think it's even more fair to say that with the group that I meet with on Thursdays, that I'm probably the one in the room that disagrees with others.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough.
I don't think it matters. The same thing, the Methodist Foundation did a wonderful thing for me and others with the LEAP Leadership Excellence thing. We had a group of 15 people, and we met for 3 years at various retreats. And we crossed the theological spectrum. We had people of different races, different ethnicities, different theological positions. We met for 15, there were 15 of us. Met off and on for 3 years. And at our last gathering, I was called to preach the closing sermon. And I remember saying at that time, I said, my prayer for the United Methodist Church, or my church, is that there will always be room in my church for my 14 best friends. And, I think that's a powerful thing. We had a lot in common. We had way more in common than we had in disagreement. But we could disagree about almost anything. You get a group of people together. But it is the connection. There's the formal connection. And then there's the very informal connections that we make. And some of these, my clergy friends, a lot of the people that I thought would be my clergy partners throughout the journey are in the process of disaffiliating. And I hurt for my friends and the loss of our connection. This isn't easy for anybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we were talking on one of our previous episodes with, I believe it was with Brady Whitten, talking about a generous orthodoxy, and the metaphor that Brady used was that of a football field, what's in bounds and what's out of bounds. And to hear Truman talk about how it sounds like that playing field is wide, and there's just this one or two issues that suddenly have caused all this division.
Metaphors break down at a certain point, but
right.
I think to play that one out just a little bit more, two teams meet on the playing field. They compete against one another. They're on opposite sides of a ball, in the competition of it all. But usually at the end of the game, you see significant representation from both of the teams, typically coming together. And I'm wondering if we started with the coming together and then shifted to the competition. Because Truman, to your point, if you begin in your relationships with others with what you have in common, and then work toward what you might have as differences, I think the relationship takes on a different tone and has a different meaning for you than if you start a relationship focused on the things that you disagree with. Rarely do you get beyond those to find what you do have in common. I thought that was a beautiful
Yeah.
That's completely true. And just to carry it a little bit further, my Thursday afternoon group was started. We met the first week of April in 2020 was the first time we met. We had everything in common at that point. Our churches were locked down.
Oh, wow.
The world was shut down. We couldn't see each other. We couldn't go have coffee with our preacher friend down the road. And we had everything in common at that time. I think part of the reason why we have so much trouble is when things get too comfortable. We can get to the minute things. And I don't want to downplay any one issue.
Yeah.
And I was impressed by Jessica's story.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to downplay that when I say minute. That's not what I mean.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's so much that we can agree about.
That's right.
Before we ever get to the things that cause us trouble.
And if we disagree about those, we disagree in love, and we come together and we continue in relationship with one another as United Methodist Christians. I thought that's just a beautiful way, to state it, Truman.
Truman, I watched your first sermon.
I knew you had.
I watched your first sermon in Gonzales, and you said something that I think I don't know if I know you weren't preaching for this particular episode of Staying, but you talked about the simplicity of a life with Jesus, and that we tend to overcomplicate matters. And here we are at this particular point in time. And do you get a sense that sometimes maybe we've forgotten how simple and acknowledging that there is difficulty and it could be full of challenges, but the simplicity of matters?
I think it is. It's one of my things that I say a lot. Being a Christian is simple. Being a Christian is one of the simplest things there is. I can tell you in a minute how to be a Christian. You love God with everything you've got. You love his creation. You love his world. You love his edicts. You love his creation. And then you love his people. Mm-hmm. And sometimes what I have found is when we start on the question of loving his people, is the person that we have the most trouble loving is ourselves. Mm. And we're called to love ourselves as well as we love someone else. If you can do that, if you can love God with everything you've got, and you can love his people, including yourself, and show it full time, I think you're living the Christian life. Simple and easy aren't always the same thing. Sometimes it's not easy to walk that path. Sometimes there's people we don't want to like. There's people we don't want to forgive. I think until we get past that, all the other questions are secondary. I think if we love each other enough, the rest of those things fall into place.
And for those who are watching, that is the simple message of loving one another. Sometimes I think where some of the challenges, specifically regarding the issues that we're talking about, get into the structural nature of things, and that's where things can get complicated. And it's a difficult. It's a challenge. I know it's a challenge for you, and it's been a challenge for me in the midst of all of this. Is to balance that.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking back to our segment on Scripture, and we talked about how the Bible often interprets itself, and how Jesus certainly interpreted the Hebrew tradition, and oftentimes elevated it to a higher standard. If we start with that notion of God's mandate that we love. Mm-hmm. And Jesus reaffirming that and essentially raising the bar that we even love those whom we would consider enemies. Mm. And we are to pray for those who we may feel are persecuting us, or persecuting anyone. I mean, it does raise it to the level of allowing God's love, made real and tangible to us through Jesus Christ, to become the very thing that binds us together in this wonderful tension of being a follower of Jesus and a United Methodist Christian. It goes that tension sometimes, is always pulling us to a higher level of dedication to love. That's a beautiful way to say it.
Amen.
Truman, where do you see hope?
I see hope in a lot of places. That might be a crazy thing to say in this day and age. But
I think some of us need to hear that.
Yes.
2 weeks ago, I was at the Wesley Center at Woodworth, and we had over 300 United Methodist youth from around the state gathered for their fusion event. I saw 300 United Methodist youth celebrating being together. The only time in that entire period that I heard discussion of these issues that are tearing us apart is when two clergy happened to get in the corner together. We have a mission field that was full of promise, and I see hope in that. I see hope in the people that are taking a deep breath and saying, let's see what's best for ourselves and our churches. I see hope in my clergy friends who are struggling in this time. I feel incredibly blessed that the church that I'm serving is no more interested in disaffiliation than I am. So it hurts me with these close clergy friends that I have. The hurt is real in our churches, but the hope is still where the hope always was, that we can push aside what's tearing us apart and love one another.
Well, I can't think of a better way to end this episode. Truman, thank you so much for your time today and coming over here and your willingness to share your story.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Van.
Yeah, thanks.
And we thank you for joining us here on the Staying Video podcast series. And as always, we invite your comments, and you leave us a comment on the Facebook page or on the YouTube page, or you can send us an email, communications@la-umc.org. Thanks again for joining us. For Van, for Truman, for William Willoughby behind the scenes, I'm your host, Todd Rossnagel. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great day.